other than that, I'm just going to begin. You'll see the recording has started. My topic, so I had to take a 2-credit course, and for Lexington, that's actually a full load for us because we are monthly. So every month we go through courses. And so this 2-credit course was an intensive, which normally would be taught in person, but with COVID, we stayed online this year. And it is on the history of Christianity. And then we were asked to narrow that down to something that you enjoyed learning about or you found interesting, and pick a topic to present to a group of people who are willing to listen to you give this lecture. So you are my willing participants. So I'm going to go into present mode so that you can follow along with me. Or let's see, I got to close my Word. The one thing about Google Meet is I'm so new to it, but it's free, which is what's really nice. And as a student, I don't have money to pay for another Zoom membership. So can you all see my screen okay? I'm going to blow this up a little right about there. Does that look okay?
Looks good.
Okay, good. So this is information on the term invisible institutions, which actually was given to the idea of the slave churches by Rabideau, who is an author and writer on Black theology and Black history and slave history. And so a little bit about where we're starting, because I think often we forget the historical timeline and what is going on in the world when I'm talking about slavery. Our first real look at this is there is a group of letters written by Dom Afonso I of Congo, whose real name is actually not Dom Afonso. His African name is Mvembe Nzinga. And the Portuguese come to what is now known as Angola, back then Congo, and they convert him, and he becomes a real believer and a true Christian. And he changes his name and really takes up the cause of being a Christian. Unfortunately, the Portuguese used this as a means to get into his country and take over his kingdom, in a sense, for slavery. His first letter to the kings of Portugal is like, he's kind of okay with them taking some of the men. As long as they'll provide theological education, they'll continue to help build some infrastructure. And then you see several years later, the letter that he writes to the Portuguese is pretty awful. They have now taken women, children, noblemen, and his country is really being destroyed by the Portuguese. In fact, he says, we want nothing from you but sacrament, and only send wine and bread, and leave us to be. And that is really like kind of the big first hit of slavery. And most of those slaves go into the West Indies. The other thing that I think is important to point out is the natives that were here in the United States and also in the Caribbean died very quickly from disease. And what they found out is that the Africans didn't. So the Africans actually had immunity to many of the same diseases as the Europeans. And so it was actually that's one of the biggest reasons why they chose to continue pulling Africans from their homeland, was that they had immunity. The 1619 date, as some of you might know, the 1619 Project, and there's books and they've launched curriculum. That is the year that slavery actually comes to the United States. Often we think Columbus, we think of other things, but actually the first slaves arrived in Jamestown in 1619. And also, just to give us a little perspective, 1620 is the Pilgrim Rock, and you have the Pilgrims. And then 1630 is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where you have Puritans. Also, there's larger amounts of Quakers and Mennonites coming in that time. And just to give you an idea of the sheer size of slaves that were brought here, there was 700,000 by 1790, which was 18% of the US population. And then by 1860, which is the census taken before the Civil War, there were 4 million slaves in the South alone. About 500,000 free slaves in the US in total. And so you're looking at quite like 89% of all slaves living here were not free in 1860. So the term invisible institution actually is just a nicer term, but really these are called hush harbors, bush harbors, brush harbors, and they were places where slaves would meet away from their masters to worship in private. It was primarily through these religious rituals and the carving out of a black sacred space that enslaved persons were able to affirm self and create a world over against the world preferred by the masters of their families. And so these next few slides, because this is on a kind of the foundational theology and religion of the slave church, are going to go into what a hush harbor, really what they would do there, what they would worship, and how they would worship. So these are images of kind of what we imagine these hush harbors to look like. Often they are out in the woods away from the plantation. Sometimes they were rudimentary structures that kind of like a shack. But these are just images of what that might have looked like. There were some challenges with worshiping in a hush harbor. If you were caught doing these services and you did not have your slave master's permission to have these hush harbors or to have any form of meeting, you would be killed, you would be severely punished. You had to keep kind of quiet during worship, depending on where they were located, because if you were, when they were singing and dancing going on, if the master would hear, then that would lead to a punishment. And then the other thing is to remember here, most of these people were illiterate. So everything was through memorization. And so there's a lot of call and response, which is something you'll still see in a lot of the Black church today, is there's going to be a more call and response and emphasis on memorization of scripture. I want to say these are quotes from actual slaves. So excuse the terminology that they use. I obviously, don't want you to think that I use these words, but it's important that you understand this is for them. This was how they spoke. These are actual slaves from North Carolina and Texas who are just pointing out that, the white folk feared them. Any form of religion and education was kept from them, but they felt a call by God to worship, and they would sneak off to the prayer meetings. And sometimes the patty rollers would catch us and beat us. Another quote from Adeline, who was enslaved in Texas. They never got to go to church, but they'd sneak into the woods and pray to the Lord that the Lord would set them free. And then if they got caught or heard, in her case, she says the noise that they heard at the big house caused them to get whipped. So they met in these hush harbors and they worshiped, even knowing that there could be punishment. Their theology was quite awesome, and it's still very prevalent in the Black church today. Obviously, they grabbed on to the story of the exile and the Exodus and Moses and setting the people free. That's a very large piece of their theology. They also relate very well with the idea that Jesus was born in a manger and in that lowly, lowly place, like amongst animals. That's because they are being born amongst the animals. They can really relate to his nativity story. The other thing they can really relate to is his death and the cross. And this is something you can see is when we sing, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" For African Americans, often there is a sense and a feeling that, yes, we were there. We've been there with him. We can feel what he's felt through our horrible oppression and suffering. So there's a large connection to the, exile stories where there's freedom, the nativity, and the cross. The other thing that's really interesting is many of us have heard of Frederick Douglass, who ends up becoming a slave that, becomes free. he uses Matthew 23, which is woe to you. It's kind of the, hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And he uses that throughout several of his narratives. And in his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, he uses it specifically as they, the masters, attend with pharisaical strictness to the outward forms of religion, and at the same time neglect the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith, which is then mimicked as for those of us who know Matthew 23, when Jesus says, you are not, Pharisees, what happens, why aren't you using or weighing those bigger matters of mercy, judgment, and faith? And so that's one that continually gets used. Psalm 137 is another scripture that is often seen over and over again. Frederick Douglass uses it in his What to the Slave is the 4th of July in 1852 by the Rivers of Babylon, which also becomes a song that the slaves sing. By the rivers of Babylon. I think, if you know it, and so that is kind of used later than in their coded messages and singing. For those of us in the United Church of Christ tradition, we all know Galatians 3:28. There is no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free. There's no longer male and female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. So this was a very popular one. However, this was one that would be removed from the Bible. So there were slave Bibles that were given to slaves. They would be heavily excerpted and pages missing, certain terms would be changed, and words, specifically anything having to do with slaves being free. So it depends. Now, the West Indies had very strong versions of slave Bibles that were used very, spread around. In the United States, they know that some of the material was corrupted, but not necessarily a full out slave Bible. Some may have gotten here from the West Indies, but there was a lot of, they'd rip out a page, they'd cross out verses, and they would tell people, you can't use that part of the Bible. As I mentioned, they used song and they danced and they sang, but the songs also had other meanings. So a lot of the cherished songs that we know from worship that have a history in African American culture are actually coded messages. And so I want to play you this quick little video off of PBS. It's very short about the songs and the coded messages.
Words we're saying have a double meaning. So anytime you hear anything about traveling shoes or chariots or wheels, somebody's getting ready to run. And so you take a Negro spiritual. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. That chariot is moving. That chariot is swinging low, picking you up, putting you on that Underground Railroad, taking you somewhere to freedom. So when we sing those songs, it's like, something's getting ready to happen. So I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Jordan, that was metaphor for the Ohio River. A band of angels coming after me. Those conductors coming to help you, coming forth to carry me home. So they had all kind of little messages. The slave master would hear us singing and say, they sound pretty happy tonight. Next day, 2 or 3 people gone. We put that message out. We talked about wait in the water. Wait in the water. Wait in the water. But God's gonna trouble the water. Just in that water. Because the dogs can't pick up the scent. There are all these songs that said, it's time to move. It's time to go by the waterway. It's time to follow the North Star. It's time to start looking. It's time to start traveling. It's time to start getting ready to cross over that Jordan. Still away to Jesus. Oh, Lord, they're going on to heaven. No. Still away home. I ain't got long to stay. Still away to Jesus. Still away. But it sounds like we're just talking about a life in the hereafter, but we're talking about a life in the here and now.
Okay, let's go on. I hope you found that interesting. I thought that was a very nice little short video that just highlights a few songs that we sing on throughout our year in church. And wade in the water, you're washing off your scent, so that you can run away. I think a lot of us probably maybe knew there was something to Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, but not the full message and what that meant, or the use of the Ohio River as the River of Jordan. And so I hope you enjoyed that. Something that's interesting, that I found very interesting, is the mixing of the African traditions and what became known as Hoodoo. And this is different from Voodoo. This is different from Santeria. Voodoo is got some similarities in this, but it's a little different. So I'm going to focus more on Hoodoo, which was a set of spiritual practices, traditions, and beliefs that evolved out of various African religions and practices. Many of the slaves were not allowed to stay, obviously, in family groups or even from the same clan or country of Africa that they were brought over. And so you have, 5 to 10 slaves, all from different areas, bringing their traditions together. Talk about a melting pot. And so you have this really eclectic incorporation of beliefs that come out of this hoodoo. The hoodoo could be incorporated into Christian worship, but it could also be outside of the Christian worship. The awesome thing too about hoodoo is women were kind of powerful with the hoodoo. So it was great to see the female finally getting a position of power, even if it's still they're in slavery. Women would be midwives. So a lot of the midwives that were back in those days, I always wondered, I wonder how slaves are giving birth, who's helping them? Well, it was conjurers or hoodoo. They also were so good at medicinal treatments that white masters would actually call for the conjurer on the plantation to come and give medication or herbal remedies to, the whites. The other thing about hoodoo is they really bring it together with the Christian worship when it comes to like luck and charm. It's kind of a folk tale in some ways on how they use the hoodoo. But back in that time, everyone believed in ghosts. Everyone believed in kind of like fairy tales and folk tales. And so hoodoo naturally just kind of came right into their Christian worship service. And so one of the things that was kind of a hoodoo tradition, or something we even have to this day, is the lucky rabbit's foot. So the rabbit foot would be used by slaves. They would have a conjurer place kind of a spell or a prayer, and often they were very similar. It would be hard to tell the difference in many ways between a spell and a prayer when a conjurer did it. It wasn't the hocusy pocusy type feel. And then in this case for Patsy Moses, who was in Texas, they actually believe that this man was able to get free because of that prayer and rabbit foot. And so there is a lot of power in those mystery kind of religious feelings and those unusual spells or hoodoo conjuring feelings. It gave them a level of confidence that they normally would not have as a slave. Just to know that someone was, conjuring or praying over you, you would take that next step into trying to become free. One of the other ways that African traditions came in was through the dancing. And so in this next little video, you are going to see that it's called the ring shout. And to this day, it is still performed in churches. The clapping and the stomping was their only way to mimic drumming. So they didn't, have their drums from Africa. They use calls, cries, and hollers, and there's also a call and response again that I spoke about earlier. Today we would see it as kind of a praise break. It's also a reason why you may hear in Black churches that call and response to when a minister or a pastor is preaching, when they're like, "Amen, yes, brother." This is that movement that we look, that is kind of like known in the Black church. So this is just an idea of what it would have looked like. And they do it still to this day. Let's see. Come on. So that's a little bit to just demonstrate that ring shout that they would perform. Now, if there's an invisible institution, that means there has to be a visible one, right? So, and there is. There are some slaves that are lucky enough, if you want to call it luck, to be allowed to attend their slave owners or the white church. They often, as I think many of us might know, had to sit in corners or up in the balconies. And they would receive a different sermon or message from the pastor, and it would be one about obedience and to like honor your master. They also had circuit riders. So the circuit riders that would go to small little towns would also come to plantations, and they would preach. And these were white circuit riders. And again, they would come on horseback and then sit the slaves down and teach them a lesson on how they should be obedient. They should serve their master correctly. The circuit rider would only use certain parts of the Bible when he preached to the slaves. And then there were some Black slave preachers. Probably one of the most famous that we have all heard of is Nat Turner. He showed really strong signs of intelligence at a young age, and so he was taught to read and became a slave preacher. And he would go around to different slave plantations and preach to their slaves. And it led to the uprising that he leads. Interestingly enough about Nat Turner is he actually believes he is called by God to do this. He sees in a dream or a vision that the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said, "The serpent was loosened, and Christ has laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that I should take it on now and fight against that serpent." He said in another sign, he saw God telling him to fight against the white slave owners. And he translated that message then into, "I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons." On the day of a solar eclipse, he believed that was his sign from God to lead this uprising. This uprising didn't end for 4 days. There was quite a few deaths. It was the first major uprising by a slave or by a group of slaves. And this actually led to a lot more stricter laws against slaves. So a lot of Black slave preachers were slapped down. The education, if they received any, was taken away. And it actually leads to a really kind of like dark time for slaves before the Civil War actually, occurs. If you want to watch a pretty close documentary, it's a Hollywood movie, but something very close to the story of what Nat Turner really did. There's some differences, but not too much. The Birth of a Nation is a 2016 film. I recently watched it. It is very difficult. I will tell you that emotionally, they do not shy away from the realities of what slavery was like and what the punishments were. So just be emotionally prepared for that. But it is in a really well done Hollywood movie of Nat Turner. Then I want to highlight something here on the abolitionists. I think a lot of us are aware of what they did, and that's often talked about more in history. But there was a group of two sisters that caught my attention in this class that I want to really touch on really quickly. And that is the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina. They were born and raised on a South Carolina plantation. They are white. They were denied education because they were women, they were girls. So their brothers would sneak them education, and then they would go out to their slaves and sneak education to their own slaves. Both of the girls could not stand growing up with slavery going on. They actually would run away. And so when they became young adults, they moved to Philadelphia and they became Quakers. And very quickly, they started to write and speak up about slavery since they had firsthand knowledge of what it was like to witness such horrors. And so Angelina Grimke writes what is a kind of a famous piece for some of us who want to study this on appeal to the Christian women of the South. And she is literally asking Southern white women to use their power, which for them is to turn their head of their partner, the man, to get rid of their slaves. So she recognizes that the female is oppressed, that they hold no power, and their only power is through their husband, their brothers, their uncles, the men in their lives, and that they need to channel that power and try to get these men to stop having these slaves. She does also talk to the women about their power in a way that, for those of us who study theology, she actually talks to them about the Exodus 1:15 through 21, where Shiphrah and Puah decide to save the children, and kind of cruel mandates by bad leaders should not be followed. She also talks about, if you're going to be a true Christian, there are going to be times where you need to make hard choices and you may suffer. But if you suffer because you're doing the right thing, that's okay. We will see that this later has similar messaging with Martin Luther King and also Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who talks about the suffering as a disciple. But she actually says all of this first, yet rarely do we know that. She also is aware and comes to the idea that in her oppression as a female, she can relate to others who are oppressed. So she also is kind of the starting point for the idea that you can be oppressed in more than one way. It can be color of your skin. It can also be through your gender. And that lays some groundwork for others who start to look at that comparison and how those who are oppressed can relate to each other. And she does become a suffragist and is a huge part of the women's movement. But it's interesting that she kind of starts off and helps kick off some theology that we see later on used. Now, the next piece, I'm almost done because I said this would be on the slave church. So just a brief little thing just to show you that it's taken quite a bit of time for the Black church to really, and for African Americans to really get somewhere in the church. Yes, some of these show like they start in 1787. There's a Free African Society in Philadelphia, First Baptist Church, in 1800. And then the First National Baptist Convention is in 1895. But if we look at Protestant churches, and I know the UCC likes to say, hey, we've got that Congregationalist in there in 1785. Really, there's not a lot of movement outside of those few or rare people that get ordained until like the 60s and 70s. And once again, yes, it is the UCC that does give, the Reverend Joseph Evans, it becomes the first president of a denomination and he's African American. The Catholic Church is really far behind on reforms. Only until in 1987, folks, did the Blacks of the Catholic Church actually have a voice. Did they create the National Black Catholic Congress? And women who were Black in the Catholic Church were not even allowed to really be nuns fully in a full Black sisters until 1968. So the church didn't really grab on to having, African American leadership. It took some time. And we kind of want to just end with some of the bigger names. The story does keep continuing. We just celebrated the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So I encourage you, if you haven't read The Letter from a Birmingham Jail recently, take it out, look it up, and read it again. It's quite incredible. We have the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who we may relate with Obama, who used to attend that congregation. And his Black theology is all about government lies, God doesn't lie. And then we have a really awesome Black feminist theologian, Kelly Brown Douglas. If you haven't read her material, I recommend it. She talks about the plight of being both Black and a woman in a lot of her work. And it's really a interesting stuff that she writes. But we have those leaders still today, and the story does continue. But that's not the focus of this tonight. We can always, continue that. But really, it's more about that foundation and where and what did they, grow upon. And here's kind of that story of what now, if you go to a Black church, you might see elements of this still in their worship today or in their theology, and you can understand it, that it's literally comes right out of their history. And that is the end. So I'm going to stop sharing. So, any questions or thoughts or ideas?
Righty, are there still some of those churches, if they had a physical place, are there some that have been preserved?
There are some, yes. The ones that were shacks, more or less, there's several of them that are preserved in the South. Those usually got reinforced if they were able to last long enough. And so I know I have written down somewhere a couple of the names of them. And now they'll say out front, Free Baptist Church. And next to it'll be the new building, but in the back will be the old little kind of shack that they've reinforced to keep it for historical purposes.
Thank you.
A Google search will do it too. It'll come right up.
Okay.
I'm coming to you from Arkansas, and I want to mention that many of the stories that I hear from around here, the faith communities were meeting in the woods or in a place where they couldn't be found. So there was no building to maintain or to protect. It was just a matter of people trying to find a safe place to meet, and that might change at any given time. I also, Bridie, I want to appreciate where you tied it into Cameroon and the Congo and the Belgian King, and some of that at the very beginning. I will say that when I was in residency as a chaplain, one of the others in my cohort was a Catholic priest from Cameroon who was Black, and he would talk about about the emotional and spiritual legacy
Mm.
within the Black community there in Cameroon, relating American slave histories, because apparently he suggested that there's quite a bit of guilt for whatever part the ones that weren't enslaved took in allowing the system to be founded and to continue.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and it's also really hard because there used to be in history kind of the rule. It sometimes written, sometimes unwritten, but if you were baptized, you were kind of off limits as being a slave by other Christians. It was supposed to be that way. Now there were ways around it, obviously, as we see here. But this is the first time where we actually see slavery really become hereditary as well, too. It continues in your family line for the first real time. It also is the first time where what was it? I lost my train of thought. But indentured servitude used to be more of the term what we would consider when they talk about slave often in history. It's more of what we would think of as an indentured servant. This is where it literally becomes chattel. It's no longer a person. And so it's really it's an odd time. It's also the first time too where race really starts to matter. Prior to this, like Christians, Jews, Muslims, nobody looked at the color of skin. Like that was not an argument in the world before, around Crusade-ish area, we'll put it, when there started to really be that increase of, discrimination, and all of a sudden skin tone just starts to matter out of nowhere. Otherwise, diversity was plethora of diversity. And, but no, all of a sudden we can use these people. So we're going to use the skin tone. We're going to use their immune ability to disease. We're going to forget that they're baptized, and we're going to start treating them as cattle. Anyone else? Happy Black History Month.
Thank you.
But it is a good month to remember this, and the Black church to this day is a community for people. Just like it was their kind of hush harbor out in the middle of the woods was their moment to become a community. I mean, they had discussions on their civil rights, and eventually the Black church. I mean, that's why you see in politics today, there's quite an immersion between the church and politics when you're an African American. It's a safety place. It's a place where you can talk freely, you have freedom, you can organize, you can help one another. It all comes from what they were allowed to do as slaves, and that being their only place of safety and time to be a community. Anyway. Otherwise, yeah, Stephen.
Bridie, I unmuted myself only to make sure that I have the opportunity to thank you. This was wonderful. A lot of information that I had no understanding of, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate you being here. Otherwise, unless, yep, Jamie?
Just as a quick aside, there's a novel called The Invention of Wings. It's Sue Monk Kidd, and it is the story of the Grinke sisters.
Oh,
so I would
there we go.
recommend it. I thought it was very good.
Yeah.
So
I gotta say, I really, we had to do a paper for this class, like a research paper, and I did that. For that one, I picked the Grimke sisters. So
yeah,
it was pretty awesome to read about what they did. They were like the first women to speak at like the Massachusetts state legislature ever, or have a mixed crowd of male and female, and so it was pretty awesome to hear their story.
yeah, and they paid for it, unfortunately. And so
yeah,
Mhm.
but Okay, well, have a great night, everyone. I really appreciate you coming. I will alert people again when I have another one of these little lectures if you want to keep attending. But I thank you for coming tonight. Okay,
Thank you.
Have a
bye-bye.
blessed night.